very happy to be here today to see all of these amazing authors and artists come together to share their talents, their insights, and their books with us. This afternoon, we will have the pleasure of hearing from two esteemed authors, Monica Bhide and Namrata Patel. Monica Bhide is equal parts storyteller and globetrotter. She's an award-winning author, accomplished literary coach, and an educator with over 15 years of experience. Her words have appeared on renowned platforms, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Food and Wine, amongst many others. In addition to this, she's appeared as a regular voice on NPR and has recently launched a podcast called Powered by Hope. She's the author of The Soul Catcher. Set in modern India, The Soul Catcher is a novel and stories. It takes us on paths about destiny, grief, loss, love, and sisterhood through a diverse cast of complex characters. This book explores that which makes us human, the desire to live, the fear of death, the longing for love, and the release that comes with the acceptance of fate. Our next author is Namrata Patel. Namrata is an Indian-American writer who resides in Boston. Her writing examines dual cultural identity amongst Indian Americans and explores this dynamic while also touching on the families we were born with and those that we choose. She has been writing for most of her adult life and loves creating characters who are relatable and aspirational. Her heroines range from quiet to kick-ass, and her heroes are swoon-worthy, yet a little flawed. She is the author of The Candid Life of Meena, her debut novel. This book is about Meena, a photojournalist and nomad. She is a woman who embarks on an unexpected journey into her past in an engrossing novel about identity, family secrets, and rediscovering the need to belong. Lastly, our discussion this afternoon will be hosted by Professor Paranjape. He is a professor in English for over 22 years. He is the author, editor of over 50 books, has also published 175 academic papers, as well as articles and op-eds. He is currently a columnist in Open Magazine, Gulf News, First Post, and the New Indian Express. Without further ado, please welcome me in joining this wonderful panel today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here this afternoon. I'm very grateful to IAAC for this panel and this opportunity. And I can tell you I've been to many literary festivals. One thing she forgot to mention is I'm out of India. I'm out of New Delhi, in fact, and I teach at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU. So I want to say that I've been to many, many literary festivals, but this one is a lit fest with a difference. It's very high quality, the discussions are serious, I've learned a lot, and there's very little pretentiousness here. So thank you for this opportunity. All of the IAS team, but certainly to Rakesh Bhai, who took some extra trouble to get me here. Thank you. So without further ado, I want to mention, first of all, that these are two extremely gifted writers we have, and the books are very different. So before I ask each author to say a few words about their books, I just wanted to contextualize diasporic writing, because that's one of the mandates. This is also an extremely unusual book. It's actually a baker's dozen of, you might call it short stories or independent stories, not independent, semi-detached, woven together, connected to two important figures in the book who are in their own way soul catchers. By the way, soul catcher is actually an idea that comes from the Native American tradition. They have amulets and healing rituals for people who can, as it were, connect with souls which have gone over to the other side. Anyhow, so there are two sisters, Yamini and Damini. Yamini means the night and Damini means lightning. So one is someone who gives a passage to people who are about to die to the other side. And the other one, Damini, is someone who can heal people in great pain. So it's the story of these two sisters and many characters woven in between. There's some occult in it, and we're going to ask both writers about their experiences in writing. So without further ado, let me ask you, Namrata, once you had this central idea which is a fantastic idea because there's a mystery in it. She has to discover who her natural parents are. How did you go about crafting the book and developing and fleshing out this main idea?
Yeah, there were a lot of themes I wanted to explore in this, right? So one of the it always starts with a heroine for me, like who is this person? And I wanted to write about community and a sense of belonging in the context of diaspora, like because I grew up Indian American, you straddle East and West, and my family came in the 80s, so they brought India of the 80s, and India has obviously progressed, and Indian Americans of my parents' generation took a little slower to progress, right? So you grew up in this dichotomy of, and you were always othered, whether you're othered by Indians from India or predominantly Indian spaces, and then you were othered by Western spaces, right? So what is that sense of belonging? And then as I was researching, I came across this article about the 100 Gujaratis that came between 1920s and 1940s, and I really wanted to, A, it wasn't a history I knew, right? And B, it was this idea of like, the 80s weren't when Indians came. They came in large masses, but that there was a constant continuum and that we've been here for, you know, going back in research, like since the 1600s when Indians were brought over by the British as like servants, right? So this is this idea that I wanted to explore, and then I wanted to explore what would it feel like if you didn't know where you belonged and all of a sudden you were entrenched in this really rich collective culture, right? It's not a tragic book, right? It is a book to showcase our culture in a very positive light. It's a book to showcase like the community and the sense of how we welcome in a collective culture versus the Western part of us is very individualistic. So my character was, she was adopted at birth by white parents, and so she grew up pretty much Western and very individualistic. And then she gets absorbed in this very collective sense of culture with this rich history and a sense of legacy. And what is that tension point that you have to navigate? And that's really, so I know you talked about the process, but the process is like, for me, it's a lot of mulling until it comes, and then the first draft is really, really bad, and then you just layer on until you really get to something that is a compelling read and that you're absorbing these themes and this history without feeling, apologies, like an academic text. So.
Absolutely. In fact, I must recommend both books, but just to give you a little teaser, in this book, there's a bit of a mystery, which is that she's trying to decode who this unknown benefactor is, and she thinks it might be her birth mother.
My novel that came out in 2016 was called Karma and the Art of Butter Chicken, and it's been reviewed by every single major newspaper in the country that was self-published. So there is a market, and there is a potential for both. With big publishing houses, you may get an advance, but very little money is given towards marketing, so the authors end up doing all of the work, and self-publishing is the same. So my day job, I work for a tech company. I'm a corporate communications person by day, I write by night, and whether I'm with a traditional publisher or self-published, I'm doing all the work. So my advice is do this if you really love it. If 2 o'clock in the morning, your blank page is calling to you and saying, please, get up and write, do it, otherwise get a day job.
Yes, in fact, during the COVID pandemic, when we were all isolated, in a sense, it's our hobbies, literature, arts, culture, gardening, whatever we did, which were our passions, those were the things that saved us. Which brings me to your book, because I think both books, in a sense, Namrata, yours as well as yours, Monica, are really about healing and about, you know, the pain of not belonging and the need for clarity, reconciliation, you know. And so in your book, how did you sort of weave in this whole identity quest and the diaspora? Because, they say, oh, you're Dave, Meena Dave is the name. So she says, no, I'm not Meena Dave, I'm Meena Dave, we are Irish or something. So how did you, and let me just to frame that question a little more precisely, there's a wonderful passage where, where the protagonist finally comes close to finding out who she is, and she tells her partner, Sam Vora, she says, have you ever been someone else's mistake, Sam? It's really shitty thing to hear. So in some ways, it's about being someone else's mistake, but then having to rectify it yourself.
That's a lot into one thing. Identity is something, particularly when you live hyphenated lives, Indian American, Chinese American, and particularly if it's East-West, you're going to grow up questioning your identity in some way, sense of form. And for me, it started very early because when we came here, I was born in Ahmedabad, but came here when I was 8. So we were predominantly in a Spanish community, right? So brown. And then we moved to a predominantly white community. And so you're always trying to straddle where you fit in. And that's one of the things I wanted to explore with her not knowing where she fit. Or all she knows is she is brown skinned, but she has no identity, knowledge of what her ethnic identity might be. So it is this idea of, and at the start of the book, she's given up. She's just sort of like, I don't belong anywhere or to anyone. She's an orphan, so she just lives this nomadic life, and she's given up the search for identity. And that carries a weight on you, because every time you have unanswered questions, you're sort of, because they're unanswered, there's sort of a weight on you until you find some sort of answers. So I wanted to see what that process of healing would be like for her in this way of discovering a sense of place, a way of discovering a sense of family. And it doesn't always sort of have to have this arc of like, oh, ta-da, now I know who I am, right? Because the more you know, then the more questions arise. And that was the process of the book. And even towards the end, there's still a lot of questions that remain because the timeline for my book is about 6 months, I think. So it's this idea of like, you can't really know yourself in 6 months. You just get some answers. And that it's not necessarily self-referential in that my character is nothing like me, but it is these questions that are always, I've known what my identity is, I just didn't know like what different places were mine versus where I was othered, right? So you talk about doctor, computer engineer. I think my parents saw my high school grades and were like, this one's going into business. So my day job is in marketing. It is this whole idea of like, okay, I'm not going to be a doctor. I can't really do blood. My sister's here. She's an architect, science, and it's just, so it's this exploration that you constantly do, and I wanted to do it in the course of this story.
Yeah, of course, her slowly accepting that apartment is also, earning a sense of belonging from being a nomad. So the place, in a sense, becomes symbolic or representative of finding yourself, because, from being, Jhumpa Lahiri has a book called Unaccustomed Earth, and in King Lear, there's a line when Lear is out on the heath, unaccommodated man. So finally she gets accommodated, which is a form of healing. And coming to your book now, Monica, characters in your book are out of place, not because they're out of place in this sense, but they have special abilities and gifts. Yeah. And everybody's so harsh and mean to these gifted individuals. And these are, in a sense, occult abilities to heal. There's a character called Angela, who's in a nun's habit, but she's not a nun. She is in that dress only to protect herself because she can see the black spots on people's sort of, you might call them spirit bodies or subtle bodies, because she can detect illness before it develops. And then her mother and others want to make her a money-making machine, for example. So I'm saying it's like people who have gifts are marked, for special punishment by society.
Well, I think we're, I think we're terrified of things we don't understand. So this character in particular that he picked, Angela, it's very interesting. In India, we know about people who can read auras. That happens all the time. So when I was working on this particular character, I was struggling. So the idea behind this character was, can someone, have you guys heard of cancer-sniffing dogs? Yes? Okay, so that was the idea. Can we have a human who can look at somebody's aura and say, there's something wrong with your knee. I don't know what it is, but I see some darkness in your knee. Is that possible? So now this is a true story, and I will sign my name to it. So I am outside my house because I'm struggling with this character. I'm pacing. I tend to pace when I can't figure something out. Pacing. My neighbor, whose name is Katie, across the street, pregnant, 9 months pregnant, comes down. What's the matter? I don't know, I'm writing this crazy book, and I have this character who can see people's illnesses, but it doesn't seem real. I don't really know what to do. And she says, my college roommate could do that. I was like, no, there's no way. Like, this is so far out. I mean, he's even calling it a cult. I'm like, there's no way. And she's like, do you want to talk to her? And I said, yes. She said, okay. So she called her. She didn't give me the number. Woman's on the phone, and she's very, careful and you can tell she's got an edge to her. She sounds angry. And I said, can you really do this? And she said, well, I don't know. She said, when I was younger, I thought it was a cool game. Like, I could see somebody walking on the street and it looked like something gray was on their arm, just like a little discoloration. And then I started pointing out to my family, and they were people who were getting sick. And I said, but that's a gift, right? Couldn't you work with a doctor's office? I mean, people have psychic abilities. They can tell you who you're going to marry. Isn't it great? You can tell somebody if they're sick. And she said, I'm going to tell you one last thing, and then I never want to talk to you again. And I was like, okay. She said it was a curse and not a gift because she couldn't be around children. She said every time I went to a playground, every time I went to the pool, I could see little kids, and I would try to warn the parents, and they would get angry. Who do you think you are? This is stupid. Are you some kind of a witch? And completely ostracized from society. She became agoraphobic, right? They don't come out of their rooms. Yeah, she completely blocked herself because what was supposed to be a gift from God, just like the cancer-sniffing dog, became one of her biggest curses. So
usually ignorance is bliss, because if you knew how your karmas are going to unfold, you might not even sign up for the particular life or body you did. But I'm going to bring you back to earth a little bit. And
well, what is the point of that?
What I wanted to say was that, whereas Namrata's book is set in Boston, it's very specific. You have a sense of the city. Your book is set in India, but it's not very recognizable. You have places like Shahjahanabad, but it's very abstracted. You have malls, and you have things that in the book which are not there in India, and housing complexes, guards. I can recognize the characters in a way, thugs and rapists and all kinds of bad people, as well as good people, but I don't get a sense of place. The place seems to be completely abstracted, like almost in a fantasy or a science fiction text.
Absolutely, it is a fantasy. It is absolutely a fantasy. I wanted to keep the story very specific on the characters and their abilities and their experiences. To me, in some ways, the place was immaterial. And people who read that, there were some reviewers who read that and talked to me about it and said, I wish you had been more specific about, well, you guys know Shahjahanabad is Delhi. So if you know, you know. When you start reading the book and you start looking at the old references, it's there. The first story is based in one of the oldest step wells of Shahjahanabad. It's one of the oldest step wells of Delhi. It's in Connaught Place. And that particular step well has a history.
Agrasen ki Bauli.
Agrasen ki Bauli. That has a history that says, you know, if you go, there's these ghosting tours of Delhi. Okay. So if you go on the ghosted tours, they tell you that Agrasen ki Bauli is the place where people would go and commit suicide. It has dark waters. Yahan log marne aate hain. In this book, the euthanasia train is under Agrasen ki Bauli. It's the futuristic India that's underneath a very old historic India. So if you look at it, there are layers of environment, but they're part of the characters almost, and not necessarily someplace they
That's
inhabit.
what I wanted to say, that the characters are psychically very real and alive, even archetypally so, but the sense of place, the rootedness in the ground doesn't come through, because actually Shahjahanabad is that old city.
Old Delhi.
Yeah, not so. Agrasen ki Bauli is in New Delhi, and Mehroli is another city, Kotla, anyhow, it doesn't matter. So what we're going to do now, before I throw it open to the audience, is to invite both authors to read a brief excerpt, just 2 minutes, if you don't mind. So we'll start with you, we'll give your throat a rest, and then you have the last.
I may have one of my friends come and read it, because I...
No, it's your choice as the author. Whatever moves you, you'll see that I've marked several portions. Why don't you sit on that chair, the high chair? Here.
No, I'll sit here.
Please.
Professor mentioned that Meena discovers these notes throughout the house as she's discovering herself. So I'll just read a series of notes. Neha is a character who has died, so she only comes through from these notes. Is that better? So Neha's entire character exists through the notes, and you get a sense of who she is. So I'll just read some of her notes, and then you'll get an idea of who she is. The first one she finds is actually the first one she finds. Never trust a person who is too lazy to brew tea. The only use for generic tea bags is to reduce puffiness around the eyes. If you drink this stuff, I don't want to know you. The second note is, I'm a lexicographer, a mouthful of a word, one that doesn't quite roll off the tongue, not like chef, cop, maid, judge. I write dictionaries. I keep a record of our ever-evolving language. I like knowing that what I document, what I write, can be read long after I'm gone. I have no children, only words I spend my life defining. And then I'll just read one more. My husband left 3 days ago. I haven't gone to look for him. In fact, I wish him well. We did not suit, married only because we had both been given into societal convention. He was constantly seeking happiness, an elusive, subjective, situational concept. He's a regular sort of person. I use the present tense because I do not believe he's dead. I suppose I should start at the beginning, but to what end? That is a fun sentence. I could parse it out. It should not make sense, yet it does, because of the English language is fluid and alive. So.
May I request you to read, wonderful, may I request you to read one more where she talks about not having love, but learning to live without love. And that's the kind of moment of reckoning for Meena, the protagonist, that how terrible it is to be lonely and not have love. And the mother, I mean, not the mother, but the whatever. I don't want to give it away. I'm glad I misled you a little bit. But the purported mother, I'm saying that Meena also recognizes that same situation that she's bordering on when she realizes that she may have to live her life without love. I've probably dog-eared it somewhere. Maybe I'll even find it for you, but in the meanwhile, go ahead, please.
Damini reaches the pool of the weeping lotus. Oh, okay. I tend to bellow, so I'm trying to keep myself okay. Damini reaches the pool of the Weeping Lotus, her first destination of the night. The moon is directly over the pond. Several of the lotus flowers are snuggled on the gentle waterbed. They are closed, asleep in the quiet of the night as they wait for her to bring them strength and power to open and glow again in the morning sun. The weeping lotus, filled with the pain she gives it, is said to be the cure for the madness that haunts many. The people who know come in the mornings to gather these flowers. They crush the petals and make a paste. That paste is given to those who can't live without the doses of bhang, the sniffs of coke, the needles of heroin. The petals take the addiction away and bring peace to the addicts. The cycle of pain to peace through petals. That is what Damini really offers the world. The air is cool. The veil between the worlds is thinner and easier to penetrate at this time of the night. Damini shivers a little as the breeze envelopes her water-soaked kaftan. As always, she does a check of the surroundings, making sure there is no one around. Almost ritualistically, she checks her phone. There is only one message that had come in earlier from Yamini. It is your night. Be free, my sister. Be free. I love you, and I would lie if I said that I didn't envy you this night. Believe, Yamini. Remember when Mother told us about the poet Rumi? Your salvation is seeking you, I promise. There are no other calls, no messages.
It's a very nice segue to this passage, which is also about love.
I do not know the meaning of love. Even its definition is abstract. Strong affection based on kinship. My parents are my kin. If providing for me is considered strong affection, I suppose I have that. But I do not feel anything for them except that I come from them. If it is sexual desire, I have that for my husband, but have no other use for him. What does it mean to hold someone dear? I've concluded that I do not care for it. Let it exist for others. I am enough without it.
Of course, nobody is enough without love, right? But I'm going to throw it open to all of you. But before that, I want to acknowledge my cousin, Mr. Ramesh Sarva, who's come all the way from Little Neck. And he started off as a CPA, but he's a businessman and a philanthropist. And I hope that he'll also join the IAAC family. Thank you, Ramesh, for coming. Yes, sir. Take the mic if you're
okay. You were saying how you're an engineer by day and a writer at night. So I wanted to ask you, how does your training as an engineer help you to solve the story's problem, or how to write a perfect story, or how does that work?
It makes me question everything. I ask a lot of questions. I'm very curious by nature, so just help. I don't know that there is a perfect story yet, but I ask a lot of questions.
Well, I guess the plot has to be engineered.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it helps in plotting. You know, like with the question of the soul catcher, can this happen? You take that thread down, keep going until you can no longer answer the question, and then go back and do it again. And so I did it for all the characters. The other thing that I've done is that every single character in all my books, this is a very engineering brain, has a character profile. I can tell you how they vote. I can tell you who they would marry. I can tell you if they're crossing the street and there was a bus coming, would they save their husband or their wife? Like literally, that much detail. So if you have that much detail about your characters, then you put them in a room and let them talk to each other and play. And the story comes, it gives birth, right? The hardest part is understanding your characters. because otherwise you don't know what their reactions would be. So that's maybe my boring engineer brain.
Professor Narayan Hegde?
This is a question for Namrata. At least in the beginning of your novel, the protagonist, first-person narrator, seems to be quite comfortable in her skin, in that she feels that she was loved by her adoptive parents. But it's only when she inherits this apartment, the quest for her identity is sort of forced upon her. The rest of the residents of the engineer house, they say, your name is not Dev. It is Dave. It's a quintessentially Gujarati name.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if that quest was sort of forced upon her rather than her own need for finding herself.
That's a great question, great insight. She had given up, so that's why she was comfortable in the not knowing.
Yeah.
But it goes back to not knowing is also just a way of avoidance, right? So sometimes things are forced upon you that make you deal with the things that you've avoided. And if you are an Indian auntie, you know how that works, right? So the aunties in the book are really like, no, we are going to put you on this quest, whether you want to or not. And then the main growth for her is to come to terms with wanting to know. So she goes from not wanting to know to wanting to know because it was forced upon her. And it was a very intentional conceit to make sure that we can go through life not knowing forever, and that's fine, right? And in this case, I wouldn't have a book if she just never wanted to know.
That's a great answer, but actually, in a sense, the book supplies, the motivation, because when Sabina, one of the aunties, says, go away, you're a nomad, give up this apartment, others who belong need it more, she says no. So she's just been pushing it away, but then when she gets drawn into the quest, her being flowers, human flourishing happens. So knowing the quest leads to human flourishing in both the books. That's the commonality, that people who pursue their quest till the very end, they flourish, and even death doesn't prevent their flourishing. In a sense, Neha has flourished after her death because of her gift and her, if I may say so. But let's take a couple more questions. There's one behind you, please. From someone who said she was my student 10 years ago in Hyderabad.
I'm actually going to take off from where you started setting the stage for this, Professor Paranjape. The Indian diasporic writing, he's laid it out in 5 generations. So my question to each of you is, how do you see yourself in the context of the broader diasporic writing community? What is the one thing that makes you hopeful, and what's the one thing that frustrates you the most?
I can start. So I started with Bharti Mukherjee. That was growing up, but you read Western fiction, Western novels. You didn't really have access to or knowledge of. We didn't have the internet, so that tells you what age category I fit in. When I was little. Then I moved to Chitra Divakaruni, and I was like, oh, she's writing about one part of me, right? She's writing about the immigrant part of me. And then Jhumpa Lahiri was writing about that interior world of an immigrant. But by the time I read Jhumpa Lahiri, I'd fully moved away from that immigrant sensibility. So I didn't see myself in stories. I saw stories about India. I saw stories about Indian immigration, but I didn't see a lot of stories about Indian Americans or the hyphenated lives where we blend and we walk fluidly between East and West. So that's really what motivated me. And I'm not saying that I'm the first. I'm saying that there are a lot of other Indian Americans in the last few years that have started writing about this lived experience. And so that's what makes me hopeful, is that there's more and more of us. I think what I don't think there's a downside, but I think what's challenging is whose voices get told, right? Because there's a certain amount of privilege in certain from people who've migrated from certain parts. Most of us who migrated here came from like wealthy backgrounds, wealthy families, and we get to tell our stories. And then there are a lot of different experiences of Indian Americans who don't get to. So I want more and more so that Indian culture in the Western world does not stay a monolith. It's not just Bollywood. It's not just mythology. It's not just, immigration. That there are layers to our stories, and we should have as much representation as the Western world does.
Excellent.
I can't follow that up, especially with this voice. My inspiration has always been Chitra Banerjee. She blurred my first set of short stories. So I started as a food writer, and in that I brought in the immigrant experience and identity. All of my stories are about finding identity through food. But what I found very quickly was, as a diasporic writer, I was constantly being put in a box. You can only write about your Indian experience or your Indian food or your Indian whatever you pick. So I decided to break out of that box, and that's what makes me hopeful, is that I can write pretty much about any topic now, and it's accepted. That's the most important thing. We don't need to stay in this little anything.
I think that's a great note on which to end. I believe that there is a new subjectivity, a new consciousness that is now available, and new modes of self-expression, publishing, distributing, and therefore the space in which to be ourselves in a more authentic way. In both cultures, the crossover experience is not so traumatic now. It's not the loss of the home and the struggle with the host country. I think there's a much greater flexibility and possibility, and I think that's something to celebrate. And once again, I want to thank IAAC for furthering that sense of ease and comfort with being in our own skins, wherever we are, whether we are in New York or in San Francisco or in London or in India. Thank you all very much.